been in person, but it was to have been in person, but that didn't work out. But I'm very happy that Maria was willing and able to join us virtually. I'm going to turn the floor over to Jay Parsons. Jay has a cooperative agreement with Maria's group at ERS on integrating livestock and cover crop systems in the US. So they've had considerable contact on that since last summer. And Jay knows her very well by now. So I'll ask Jay, will you please go ahead and introduce Maria, please?
Yeah, happy to do that. Maria, if you want to go ahead and share your screen while I'm introducing you to the audience. So so Maria Bowman is a research agricultural economist with the Economic Research Service, which you'll see here in a moment. She puts up her credentials for us. So she first worked for ERS from 2014 to 2018 before leaving to become the lead scientist for the Soil Health Partnership, which was a program of the National Corn Growers Association with partners and farmers to trial soil health management practices and collect on-farm data to evaluate economic and environmental risks and benefits. She recently rejoined ERS in mid-2021, I believe. Is that correct, Maria? Okay.
Yep.
And she's in the Conservation Environmental branch of the Resource and Rural Economics Division. She studies the economic and environmental impacts of conservation and soil health management in the U.S. agriculture, including costs and benefits of cover crop use for farmers and for society. And of course, as Dick alluded to, that's how we came in touch, because of course, cover crops and livestock integration and all these soil health benefits is a big deal here in Nebraska. So by way of credentials, Maria received her Ph.D. in agricultural and resource economics, from the University of California, Berkeley. She also earned an MS in forestry from Virginia Tech and has a BS in environmental science from Juniata. Is that how you say that?
Juniata, yep.
Juniata College. And she confesses to having no interest in economics when she went to college. But she decided she wanted to study economics while doing an internship in the Ecuadorian jungle during her junior year. She was studying environmental science at the time, and the conservation and development NGO she was working with had decided that figuring out how to raise capybara, which I've been told is a large rodent, but they were trying to figure out how to raise that in captivity as a way to convince the local communities to eat non-beef protein, and that was more sustainable. Needless to say, it was not quick to catch on, but she did have a very interesting semester down there and ended up writing a paper on the topic. And long story short, we're the beneficiaries of that because we get the benefit of getting her expertise in our profession, which if you look at her resume and her publications is pretty profound. So we're glad to have her here today to talk about cover crop practices, programs, and soil health outcomes in the U.S. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. That was quite the introduction. I am very glad to be here and wish I could have been there in person. Just didn't quite work out this time, but I am looking forward at some point to coming and visiting in the department. And as Jay said, I've been back at ERS for about almost exactly a year. And I got brought on, I think, at a time when the interest at USDA and in the department overall around cover crops was really increasing, in particular around cover crops and climate smart agriculture and their potential to contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. So while I'm not going to talk specifically about the climate angle today, that's certainly part of why there's a lot of investment in this work and in this portfolio at USDA. And the intersection with livestock and cover crops is particularly interesting because I think the department and in general, we're starting to understand that this space involving manure management, livestock, soil health, and enteric methane emissions, that all of that is also really important to understand when we look at agriculture's impact on greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation. So today I'm going to talk about a few different reports or pieces of work. I'm going to try and weave it together. So we'll see how it goes. Some of this is work that I've been doing at ERS, work that I was doing joint with colleagues. And some of it is also work that I was doing while I was at the Soil Health Partnership, like Jay mentioned. And that was a very different role and job from my current one. So I think it'll probably provide some nice contrast to some of the federal survey data that I'm going to talk about first. So first I want to share some highlights from an ERS report that we put out in February of last year. The lead author on that was Steve Wallander, and it was kind of it was a success story in the transition at ERS because it was a report that I think, I can't remember who started as the lead author on the report, but I was the lead author for a while, then I left, and then David was the lead author for a while, and then he left. And then Stephen stuck around, and Stephen got to claim lead authorship on the report and took it all the way through to the finish line. So we were all really excited when this came out, because it really was some of the first work we had done at ERS to answer some of these basic questions about cover crops using the federal survey that we have in ERS, which is the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. So some of the questions we set out to answer include: where are cover crops used? How common are they? And how is that changing over time? How cover crop adoption varies with different cash crops. So the ARMS survey surveys a particular commodity crop in a particular year. So we're able to look at how that varies with cash crop adoption. How farmers are managing their cover crops. So some particular questions about termination, for example. And then we also targeted the types of federal and state programs that provide financial assistance for cover crops. And I think that's one that's really valuable, maybe sometimes undervalued in our role at ERS, is putting together some of this information about what federal programs exist and what they paid for, and how that has changed over time. So I was really excited that we were able to include that as well. You all probably know this, don't have to tell you, cover crops can provide a lot of benefits: soil health benefits, water quality benefits, and adoption in general has been increasing across the US. So 2012 to 2017 census overall, there was a 50% increase in cover crop adoption. And some of the data we suggested ERS, that we collected ERS, suggests that this trend is continuing. Adoption, however, is still relatively low compared to some other soil health practices that we talk about, like conservation tillage, no-till. So just to put it into context, increasing, but still relatively low rate of adoption. I'm going to start by just showing you some of the rates of cover crop adoption that we observe in the ARMS survey. So this slide shows crop-specific trends in fall cover crop adoption from the ARMS survey, collected from 2010 to the present. And these data come from a survey question in ARMS where we asked the farmer to tell us everything that was grown on that surveyed field that we're asking them about for the past 4 years, including the cover crop. So for each of these lines, the fields are planted with that surveyed crop in the surveyed year. So for example, for that green line that's corn for silage, it would have been corn for silage in the last year, but it was in a mix of other crops in the prior years. So that green line is corn silage. Red is corn for grain, orange is cotton, blue is soybeans, and then the black lines are winter and spring wheat. And in the fall preceding the survey year, you can see that farmers adopted cover crops on about 5% of corn for grain acres, 7% of soybean acres, 19% of cotton acres in the most recent year, and 25% of corn for silage acres. So we're going to talk, I'll talk a little bit about some of the preliminary survey findings we had from that co-op agreement that was mentioned earlier. But one of the reasons we see such high adoption on corn for silage is used exclusively for feeding livestock. So farmers planting corn for silage might also grow cover crops for their forage value, in addition to addressing some of the soil health and erosion concerns on those fields. Corn for silage is also unique in that it's harvested earlier than corn for grain. So there's fewer logistical constraints as well. The farmer has a longer planting window to plant those cover crops and get them established. The other thing that I think I've been really interested to learn more and more about are some of the state level policies and programs that might contribute to some of these higher levels of adoption. So corn for silage is an interesting one because, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, they have effectively a restriction where you basically can't apply fall manure on corn for silage fields unless you have a cover crop out there, right? So they do that in terms of a residue requirement. And because the corn for silage doesn't meet that residue requirement, you can't apply manure in the fall unless you have a cover crop. So that's part of the reason cover crop adoption is particularly high in Pennsylvania. And you can see that on this map. So this is basically just mapping cover crop adoption across the US using data from the 2017 Census of Ag. So that's the most that's the finest resolution data that we have on cover crop adoption across the US. And there are a lot of reasons this varies. Obviously, different soils, cropping, and livestock systems and climate, so temperature and precipitation are big ones. Those all affect the costs and benefits of cover crop adoption in different regions. You can also see that in particular, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, cover crops are a relatively cost-effective way for addressing water quality concerns, which is part of the reason those states in the Chesapeake Bay have put a lot of programs in place. So I live in Maryland. We've been heavily promoting cover crops for well over a decade, and we have about 33% cover crop adoption in 2017 and a pretty high growth rate between 2012 and 2017. You can also see at some other state boundaries some interesting program differences. So for example, Iowa has a pretty big state cost share program for cover crops, whereas Illinois historically did not. So you can kind of see that at that state line there as well. Crop insurance, I'll talk about these a little bit later too, but crop insurance premium discounts got implemented, a lot of different programs, and some of those are contributing to some of these differences also. So another really basic thing that we looked at in the report was what types of cover crops were showing up in the ARM surveys. So again, looking at this by cash crop, we can see that rye and winter wheat grass cover crops were most common overall, and this kind of matches with what I saw when I was at the Soil Health Partnership. Those grass and small grains are, in general, farmers are fairly familiar with managing those compared to, for example, a 5 or a 10-way mix or something that's much more complicated to manage. So they're more familiar with some of the herbicides that might work with those crops. They know how to get them seeded. So I think that's part of the reason we see more adoption there first. And more than 90% of corn acres in 2016 used a grass or a small grain cover crop, so rye, winter wheat, or oats. And I just put a note in there, and Mary asked about this actually in an earlier draft of a report we were working on. I think we didn't know a lot about cover crops at ERS when we first started asking these questions, right? So we just put rye in there, not realizing that farmers were planting both cereal rye and annual ryegrass. And so I think what we wound up picking up was a mix of both. I think for the most part it's cereal rye, but we just have it in there as rye because we didn't ask to differentiate. We did start differentiating, I think maybe last year when we added the annual ryegrass as its own crop variety. In 2018, the reason soybean looks a little different, same thing. We didn't know what we didn't know. And so we added mix. We don't know what's in that mix, but now we know that more than 20% of soybean acres in 2018 had a mix prior to soybeans. So we're adding a little more detail and more information about what farmers are planting. It would be nice to get all of the individual things in the mix, but we have a mandate to keep survey burdens low, right? So we're trying to balance the things that are being asked with the amount of time that's available to get these surveys implemented. So termination methods. So we're going to look at this first by the cash crop that's coming after the cover crop, and then we'll look at it by the cover crop in the next slide also. So across the board, no surprise, terminating that cover crop with herbicide, burning it down is the most common across cover crop species or categories. I was actually relatively surprised when we started looking at these results that we saw such a high percentage that were being tilled in. But I think that partially reflects areas where there are folks that are doing winter kill cover crops, right? Because they might be more likely to have a winter kill cover crop out there. And if they're not in a no-till system, maybe they're not doing a spring burn down, and so they're just tilling. So areas where tillage is more prevalent and maybe they have a winter kill cover crop, I think that's partially what we're picking up with the tilled in. You can see that we also have harvested in here. So through the 2016 corn survey, you'll see it was just harvested was the option. But as we started to get into some of the differences in cover crop definitions, even within USDA, we began separating out whether the cover crop was harvested for grain or harvested for forage, because that can affect, in general, whether it meets some of the definitional requirements at USDA or for some of the USDA programs like at NRCS. And you can see this kind of matches with what I said before about corn silage, that harvesting is more common on those corn silage fields. And I forgot to say this at the beginning, but if folks have clarification questions or questions while I'm chatting, feel free to just throw your hand up or jump in. We don't have so many folks that I can't take some questions while I'm chatting, and we have plenty of time. I also asked Jay to keep an eye on the chat because I'm not so good at that when I'm talking, so don't be afraid. So this is termination method again, but looking at it by that cover crop species. So each bar is a cover crop species, and then the breakdown in that bar is how that particular cover crop was terminated. And again, herbicide most common, but if we look at across all these different cover crop categories, in particular, I wanted to look at this for the report where we were looking at livestock and cover crop adoption. Grazing or harvesting for forage was the reported termination practice for 11% of cover crop acreage. And it's important to remember that just because they don't list it as being terminated by grazing doesn't mean they didn't graze it, right? You might graze it at a time when it's nowhere near the time for termination. So you might graze it once or twice and then burn it down also to kill it, because that grazing may or may not be killing it. So just because we're only picking up a small proportion of cover crops being terminated by grazing doesn't mean that's the extent of grazing. So this is another one that we are changing the way we ask the survey questions to try and explicitly pick up grazing of the cover crops. You can see that those cover crops that are more likely to winter kill, like oats in some regions, are more likely to be tilled or rolled for termination. And we combined those not because they're similar termination practices, just that we had so few folks in some cases that were responding that they rolled or used a roller crimper. We just had to bucket it with something, so we bucketed it with something mechanical. Higher proportions of wheat, other cover crops, and oats were harvested for forage, and mixes and other cover crops reported grazing as the form of termination more frequently. So just a few little pieces of information there. Another thing we've been starting to dig into just at the very beginning stages of this is thinking about how cover crops are integrated into rotations and also persistence of cover crop adoption. Because one of the questions that we've had has been how many folks that are starting with cover cropping stop cover cropping, how many of them are doing it every year. And it's a little hard from the information we observe in the ARMS survey to figure this out, because we're picking up 4 years of cropping history. But just because we only observe 2 cover crops in the most recent years, we're only observing a partial truth, right? They might have started cover cropping. They might be cover cropping in a rotation. So what we did was look at the frequency of cover crop adoption in 4-year crop sequences that we had information on. So of the acres with the cover crop planted in at least one of the 4 years, there were 16% of the 2015 cotton acres. 16% had one of 4 years. 27% of the corn silage acres had one of 4 years. And so I think some of this just reflects like which commodity crops saw cover crop adoption happening earlier, right? So for cotton, it was 4 or 4 years. And if you think back to those graphs of overall cotton adoption of cover crops, it was higher than the other crops, right? So some of this is just reflecting that overall time trend that we're seeing in cover crop adoption. But also, new cover croppers in a corn soybean rotation might be implementing with one crop in that rotation. They might start with cover cropping before soybeans because it might be less risky. So that might be part of what we're seeing here too, with maybe more cover crops before soybeans, even though the overall adoption rate is not substantially different.
Can I ask a question on this?
Yeah.
So I was curious if you knew how many of these respondents were in some sort of contract that requires them to be using cover crops for more than one of those years versus those that are just choosing to do so on their own.
We do have information about whether they had a contract. We should have information about whether they had an EQIP contract or an NRCS contract in that particular survey year. We might not have information about what year that contract started. So it might be difficult to figure out whether they were required to have it in all of those years, but we could certainly do a crosstab and see. My guess would be that some of these folks that had more like 3 or 4 years are people that are participating in NRCS programs.
I had a question as well along these lines. So
Yep.
do you have any kind of information on, whether what kind of leasing land rental contracts they were in and whether their landowners were asking them to plant cover crops? Do you have any kind of that information in there?
We should have information on what their land rental arrangement is on this field. We don't have any information on whether they've had any interaction with their landlord about soil health practices. So we would be able to look at it, I think, by type of rental arrangement or land tenure, but probably not to the level of information about whether they're talking with their landlord.
Thank you.
Yep. So I'm going to bridge to programs for just a second. So that was a good segue. One of the things we've been trying to look at is how EQIP has changed its approach to cover crops over time and how some of these new programs are showing up with respect to cover crops. So in EQIP, between 2005 and 2018, funding for cover crops increased from about 7 million to more than 155 million. So quite a large increase in EQIP spending for cover crops. I'll show you a graph after a little bit of that as well. Same thing, number of acres more than quadrupled. And in addition to EQIP, there are cover crop enhancements available through the Conservation Stewardship Program. So for folks that are not familiar with CSP, CSP was kind of put together as a program to encourage continued conservation. So it was sort of targeted to landowners that maybe had gotten in the door with EQIP and then they were enhancing their conservation through participation in CSP. So it originally was geared as a program that you needed to enroll your whole farm in, and you needed to go above and beyond the conservation efforts that you already had in place. So you'll see on this next slide some comparisons around cover crops in both EQIP and CSP. And those median per acre payments for cover crops are a lot lower in CSP, but part of that is because it's usually for some kind of an add-on or an enhancement. So for example, somebody who was cover cropping before and maybe had a single species cover crop, when they enroll in CSP, they might turn it into a mix. So it's sort of a marginal enhancement to whatever in some cases was there before. But CSP is also not a minor program when it comes to cover crops. So there were more than 2 million acres in CSP in 2015, and there were quite a number of cover crop payments going out through that program. It's a much harder program to study, in part because the way that the data were managed early on for that program, they weren't fully integrated with the EQIP data, and they've changed the way they track the data for that program over time, which has made it a little bit difficult to look at how that's changing. But let me show you, I mentioned some of those trends in EQIP over time. So this is showing some new data from NRCS that shows the number of land unit acres receiving a financial incentive payment for 5 conservation management practices. And these are 5 of the top cropland management practices, not looking at some of those structural conservation practices like terraces. The orange line is nutrient management, the blue line is no-till, green is conservation crop rotation, red is mulch till or reduced till, and that purple line is cover crops. So you can see that through about 2010, the top practices were nutrient management and no-till, strip-till, and then during the last decade, like we talked about, the relative emphasis shifted toward cover crops. I think there were a couple things driving that shift. Some of it was that no-till adoption was leveling off, and so it was broadly seen that there was higher additionality with paying for cover crops. So I think that was part of what was driving this shift as well. Another federal program I wanted to mention, so I mentioned before that there had been some states that had implemented $5 per acre crop insurance premium discounts for cover crops. There was also a federal pandemic cover crop program implemented in 2021 called the Pandemic Cover Crop Program. And it did almost exactly the same thing as some of those state programs, provided $5 an acre crop insurance premium for producers that insured their spring crop, planted a qualifying cover crop, and reported those cover crop on their crop acreage reporting form 578. And they just announced, I think last month, that they are implementing this again for 2022. And so one of the things we've been really looking forward to at ERS is we've started to work with some of these FSA 578 crop acreage reporting data to try and look at how cover crops are being reported in there. And we haven't looked at 2021 and 2022 yet, but we have been looking at some of the earlier years to look at how cover crops are showing up in that data set so that we're hopefully better prepared as we're able to start integrating some of those data and looking at cover crop adoption through 2022. I mentioned state programs, and this is just a snapshot of some of the state programs, but I think it's really, I don't know, I think these are some great examples of why we see some of those discrepancies in cover crop adoption across the US. So I mentioned Maryland. Iowa and Virginia programs are two of the other largest long-standing programs in terms of dollars and acres. But Missouri pretty close behind, and these are just some of the top ones. I know, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been many, many other states that have implemented soil health targeted cost share programs as well. But you can also see it's really interesting to look at that per acre payment range and see how it differs. So you can see that even within the state of Maryland, the difference in, I think this was 2018 or 2019, was between $30 and $75 an acre. I'll talk about Maryland because it's what I know, but at least when the Maryland program began, they were actually paying for what they called commodity cover crops or harvest. Basically, they were paying for double cropping, getting people to put winter wheat out there and harvest it. At some point, they stopped that, but over the years, they've had some of these additional bonus payments. So they'll tack on $10 an acre if you plant early enough. And now they're actually tacking on $10 an acre if you terminate later, or maybe you plant green, to try and get some of that additional water quality benefit. So every program has a slightly different emphasis. And so that's part of the reason the payment range varies, as do the practice restrictions or requirements associated with the program.
Maria, what is this on the total or percent of acres within the state? I mean, Maryland's pretty small.
Yeah, I think in Maryland, it's like almost half. That's not precise, but it's a lot of acres. In fact, I was looking at the census numbers and I was like, wow, this is a really large share of acres. I think obviously it's lower for Iowa and Virginia, but Maryland definitely has the largest share. And I think it's like 30 to 50%.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. You definitely see them, like pretty much everybody where I live in a town that's outside of an agricultural area, and it feels like pretty much everybody's cover cropping. So I'm going to shift gears and share a couple of findings from the survey data that we were analyzing for this joint report that we're working with Jay and Mary and Darren and Marua and a number of other graduate students on. Just a couple of slides sharing some of what we saw in the census data. So we wanted to answer a couple basic questions, and one was how many operations with livestock were cover cropping. So we broke livestock operations into 4 different categories. I'm not going to go into the exact definitions that we used, but we broke them into cow-calf operations, dairy operations, operations that specialized in stocking or backgrounding, and then feedlot operations. And a couple of things to note here, you can see that this reflects what we saw with corn silage adoption of cover crops. There's a pretty high rate of cover crop adoptions on dairies across the board, but not a lot of change between 2012 and 2017 if you just look across the whole country. Obviously, in some individual regions, there are some changes there. And the other thing we saw in terms of change over time between the 2012 and the 2017 census was an increase in cover cropping on feedlots. So you can see increase from 19% to 25% of feedlots that reported growing cover crops. This is just positive acreage of cover crops. And a lot of that was driven by an increase in the heartland region. I'm not going to throw up a regional map, but you can probably imagine roughly where the heartland region is. So we also used some data from, it's what we call our ARMS phase 3 survey, which is an operation level survey. So it doesn't have that the amount of detail we have about cover cropping from those earlier survey results I was showing you from ARMS. But what it does do is it asks how many acres of cover crops were planted and how many of those were harvested versus not harvested. So the other thing about ARMS phase 3 is we just don't pick up very many feedlots. So we were able to look at cow-calf and dairy operations in ARMS phase 3 and then look at the proportion of cover crops, sorry, the proportion of operations that had harvested only, not harvested only, or both harvested and unharvested cover crops. So that's what this slide is showing. So again, this slide is only for operations that had cover crops, and then it's looking at the breakdown of what was happening with those cover crops. And you can see that for all of the regions that we're able to look at, more than half of the dairy and the cow-calf operations that are cover cropping have at least some cover crop acreage that is harvested. And we're assuming that that's harvested for on-farm use. I guess we don't really know that, but we're sort of making a general assumption. For dairies, 71% of dairies reporting that they have cover crops report harvesting at least some cover crops. And for cow-calf operations, it's 65%. Slightly larger proportion of operations in the Northern Crescent region, which is like New York, Pennsylvania, that region that are reporting only unharvested cover crops. So again, it could be related to this driver of adoption of regional water quality regulations that supporting that, having the unharvested cover crop out there. I'm going to shift gears for a minute. Let's see how I'm doing on time. I'm going to shift gears to some work that I did using soil health partnership data to look at some of these cover crop impacts. In particular, looking at how cover crops impact soil health indicators. So I'll tell you about what soil health indicators we were looking at, but I also just saw that there was a question that popped into the chat.
Yeah, Brad was asking on the harvested, if that was mechanically harvested or grazed or
Great
how that
question.
was defined.
So I mentioned that we had done a poor job of asking about grazing. So it's possible that farmers that were grazing their cover crops were reporting it as harvested. We do not know for sure. I suspect it's probably a combination of both, and that we're probably also missing some people that grazed it and reported it as unharvested. So I don't know, that's a little bit of speculation. I think it could mean either or both of those things. So again, what we were asking with this research question was basically, do cover crops impact soil health properties? And we're targeting the 3 to 5 year time frame because that's the data set that we had. And the data set is from the Soil Health Partnership of the National Corn Growers Association. As Jay mentioned, I was there for about 2.5 years and had the privilege of being able to work with those data. So I'll tell you a little bit more about those data here in a second. But this is also published in Nature Food if you're interested in reading the article. Here's the title, and I can also follow up with the link if you're interested. So before we dig into the soil health properties and the data set, I wanted to give you a little bit more information about the types of farms that we were working with at the Soil Health Partnership. They're mostly medium to large size Midwestern farms with corn on corn and corn soy rotations. But they're stewards, if you think about that type of identification. A lot of them are participating in conservation programs or have received payments to plant cover crops at some point. So they're engaging with federal programs, they're managing for soil health, and working with Soil Health Partnership in many cases was an attempt to try and figure out how to better manage their cover crops. So either they were getting started with cover crops, they wanted to have a trial and it was a natural fit, or maybe they had tried cover crops in the past and they had not had very good success. And this was sort of an attempt to work with some technical assistance as well as part of that process. You can see in terms of farm size categories, it's about 2/3 of the farms were between 1,000 and 5,000 acres. So again, medium to large size farms. And when I'm going to talk some more about another paper that we have that was looking at heterogeneity and cover crop management. But you can keep in mind that about half of the SHP trials were planting a single cover crop species on their trial field. And of those, about 80% were planting cereal rye. So they reflect broadly what we were seeing in the ERS survey data, which is a lot of single species cover crop and a lot of cereal rye. Also, just for context, about half of the fields in no-till, so a slightly higher proportion than what we would see on average in that region. 10% using conventional tillage, and then the remaining proportion using other versions of conservation tillage or strip tillage. I've got more information on N management, but I don't know that we need to get into that too. So, and what soil health indicators are we testing? So most of these farmers are testing for basic nutrients on their own, right? They might be grid sampling every other year, every 3 years. So part of what they were doing is in the Soil Health Partnership Program was working with us to test some additional biological and structural soil health properties. And at the time, there were a couple of different tests or testing systems that were available. We were running some other tests as well, but we were sending samples off every other year to get a Cornell comprehensive assessment of soil health at the Cornell Soil Health Laboratory. Again, we're focusing on 6 indicators that go above and beyond the basic nutrients. And those tests are being performed, if you think about a strip trial, those tests are being performed on a composite sample over a treatment or a control strip every other year. And the 6 indicators we were looking at specifically are ACE soil protein. ACE soil protein is an indicator of basically a plant available nitrogen, how much nitrogen can be made available to plants through microbial activity. Active carbon is the small portion of soil organic matter that's readily broken down by microbes as food. Aggregate stability, you can think about that as a measure of soil structure. So it literally, the way they do it in the lab is they take soil and then they have a rainfall simulator and then see how it sticks together or erodes. Organic matter is, again, the non-mineral portion of the soil, the carbon-containing portion of the soil. Respiration is an indicator of microbial activity, so that you actually take the soil and then see how much carbon dioxide the microbes produce over a set amount of time. And then water holding capacity is the capacity. It's just what it sounds like. It's like how much of a sponge is there in the soil. But we'll get into that a little bit because it's actually an interesting one and doesn't always reflect the water dynamics and water holding capacity on the field. My colleague Steve Wood did most of the empirical analysis on this. He's at the Nature Conservancy, but he ran a very basic set of linear mixed effects models with farm. In this case, it's really field level intercepts to control for management across the field and farmer characteristics. And he ran models for each indicator in each year to predict that impact of the cover crop treatment on each of the soil health indicators. I'm just going to show you the main takeaway. Again, there's a lot more in the paper, but we were trying to look at how the impact of the cover crop changed over time because we suspected that the changes might be very small if we were able to pick them up at all and that they might be growing with time. So each of the points for these 4 indicators shows the impact of the cover crop treatment on the soil health property in a specific year. And you can see that there's some indication that coefficient estimates are becoming increasingly positive with time, in particular for active carbon, aggregate stability, and soil organic matter. The other 2 that aren't on here, water holding capacity and ACE soil protein, don't show a whole lot of change. I mentioned that water holding capacity is an interesting one. It's interesting because when you take soil and you ship it to a lab, some of these tests have some pre-processing that's done. So in the case of water holding capacity, you're actually grinding it up, doing a bunch of stuff to the soil, and then seeing how much water it holds. So water holding capacity in the lab is actually driven primarily by soil texture and not by management. So much so, in fact, that Cornell stopped running it and started predicting it based upon the other properties that they had, because they found that they were able to pretty much predict what it would be based upon the other soil variables that they were testing. So again, not huge effects, but they suggest that cover crops can impact some soil health indicators in the early years on working farms, which I think we maybe didn't expect when we started working on this paper. But the other thing we try to really highlight in the manuscript is that the effect sizes that we're seeing are not likely to be super agronomically or economically relevant, right? And some of this may be, the effect sizes might be small because we have good land managers that are managing for soil health in a lot of cases on really good soils, right? So they may have been doing no-till, managing really well before they implemented that cover crop strip trial. So the marginal impact of that cover crop might have been small. But at the same time, I think it's worth discussing whether these types of small changes in the soil that are happening in the future really enough to drive private adoption decisions for something like cover crops. Having talked to a lot of farmers and worked in this space for a while, I think researching soil health made me really wonder if we were putting enough effort into researching other things that might be relevant to farmers and to the private adoption decision. So I've just listed a few things here. Yield variability at different scales. Weed suppression is a really, really important and interesting one. A lot of farmers that we worked with talked about how they were using cover crops explicitly for cereal rye residue for weed suppression. In particular, in an era where herbicide resistant weed populations have increased with more no-till and more herbicide use. I think that's one that's motivating a lot of farmer adoption decisions. The other thing too, you know, I mentioned the difference between the lab and the field. One place that shows up is with infiltration. And you know, stability of the soil and soil structure. Some of these things are not always very easy to measure in the lab. So figuring out how to measure how well soil is infiltrating during an extreme rainfall event, and some of these other more tangible things like ease of planting, soil tilth, fewer wet spots and reductions in soil erosion, making sure that we're working to quantify those at the same time as we're measuring laboratory indicators is another thing I wanted to highlight.
Maria, can I ask a question before you go on?
Yeah.
Can you go back one slide to your where you had the data? Is that,
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Just looking at the carbon and the top two there, right? Because it looks like the stability thing pretty much happened right out of the gate, and then the other 4 years are kind of holding steady. Is that? I mean, is that true? I mean, those aren't significant.
I mean, that's interesting to think about it. Certainly in terms of farmer stories, aggregate stability was the one that they would talk about the most. So it seemed like anecdotally that was mirroring what folks were seeing in the field. In particular, they talk a lot about, oh, it was a wet spring and I was able to get out of my cover crop field so much earlier because I had a lot less ponding and rutting. So I think that matches with the aggregate stability and seeing it a little bit earlier.
Okay. And then carbon appears maybe that it's something that is ongoing.
Yes,
perhaps?
I think that's true. Often active carbon is talked about as sort of a leading indicator for changes in total soil carbon or soil organic matter. So, you know, if the program had continued, I think there are a few sites that are continuing that are going to get soil carbon sampled maybe this spring. Those carbon changes take a really, really long time. So I'm excited to see over the next 5 to 10 years, as we see more and more adoption of cover crops and more investment in quantification of soil carbon, what that looks like.
Okay. And judging by your comment there, the soil organic matter there, that might end up looking differently if we look at a 10-year picture then.
I would think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maria, I have a question about the data. This is the cache data that you're looking at?
Yes.
Cornell. And could you say a little bit about how that data were generated? I missed
Yes.
it.
So I don't know how deep in the weeds you want me to go, but on each of these farms, there's like an 8-strip trial. So there would typically be 4 cover crop treatments strips and 4 control strips. And they're running that cache test every other year. And it's typically a collaboration between someone pulling, so the Soil Health Partnership every year sent out all of the soil sampling supplies and instructions and the shape files and everything required to do the sampling, typically in partnership with a soil sampling company or a private contract soil sampler who would pull the samplers, and then they'd put everything in a box and send it to Cornell, and Cornell would run the data and send it to us.
So basically, this is the same as the Soil Health Partnership data.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, these are the Soil Health Partnership data. And the interesting and slightly difficult thing that we ran into when we were doing this analysis was that, you know, how it is in a farm trial, in some of those early years, farms didn't get sampled right away, or maybe they didn't get sampled in the year they were supposed to get sampled. And it was kind of on a rolling basis, right? Because every year farms were getting added. And so everybody was being sampled on this every other year pattern, which left kind of an interesting challenge which was part of the reason we just did these every year models, because there were so many confounding factors in terms of data collection. I was going to talk a little bit about, if we have time, about heterogeneity in cover crop management. So coming from the same sample. Part of the reason I really wanted to put this paper together is because, you know, we did that paper looking at the impact of the cover crop treatment on soil health, but I knew that there was a huge amount of variability in terms of what cover cropping looked like on these fields, right? And I wanted to just document some of what we were seeing in terms of what farmers were choosing to do with cover crops, and in particular, some of the costs that we saw that were associated with that as well. So I talked a little bit about the fact that most of the SHP farms were planting single species cover crops. It was 65% of the cover crops before corn and 62% in the sample we were looking at for this paper. And we also took a look at seeding methods. So for the most part, around half of farmers were drilling their cover crops. That was the most popular seeding method, followed by broadcasting with incorporation and broadcast without incorporation. So broadcast with incorporation might look like a light tillage operation in the fall, just a light disking when they put that seed out there, sometimes with some fertilizer in their fall fertilizer application. And then broadcast without incorporation obviously could look like a lot of different things, but it's usually just putting it out there, spreading it out there. For the folks that were using mixes, the most common species that we saw that were included in mixes were radish. So an oats and radish mix was relatively common. Cereal rye was also included in a lot of mixes, and then clovers, lots of different kinds of clovers, oats, and rapeseed. Costs. So the paper that's been accepted had to be in metric units, which is, it's going to be a little confusing because the table is in dollars per hectare, but I tried to put the takeaway finding in dollars per acre on the left. So I apologize for that. I did not translate these when I was putting it together last night, but the main takeaway is that the total cost to cover crop in 2020 and 2021 was about $42 per acre and $40 per acre on those SHP trial fields. But there was quite a lot of heterogeneity in cost that varied by seeding method and also by what they were seeding, right? So you can see that the single species cover crops were a lot cheaper. The median was $32, about $32 per hectare in 2020 and $27 in 2021, compared to mixes with more than 3 species that were closer to $50 or $55 per hectare. In some cases, you know, we did quite a few case studies also during my time at SHP. And there were a lot of farmers that were able to get their seed costs way down as well, right? Maybe they were growing their own seed, or they were sourcing seed from a neighbor. A lot of different creative ways to get that seed cost down. So I think that's one area where farmers were really trying to reduce that marginal cost of cover cropping. Trade-offs in terms of cost, but also cover crop establishment success with different seeding methods. So drilling was clearly more expensive than broadcasting, but it was still the most popular seeding method, I think for the most part, because you were able to get more consistent establishment. For some people, especially, we used to hear a lot from folks that had a really large number of acres, that the time required to drill and the wear and tear on the drill just wasn't worth it. And that was where you would see broadcasting or aerial seeding in a lot of cases. So this graph actually didn't make it in the paper because we were space and words constrained, but I really liked this depiction of the range of planting dates that we saw across the SHP network. So you can see that there's a real increase in slope between about mid-September and late October. So more than half of the farmers that we were working with planted between mid-September and late October. But that window for planting cover crops stretched from June all the way to frost seeding in the beginning of the year before their cash crop planting, right? So especially in the northern latitudes, you'd hear about people frost seeding occasionally in January or February. To put it a slightly different way, about 2/3 of farmers in 2019 and 2020 planted their cover crop following a cash crop, and 1/4 of people interseeded or overseeded their cover crop while that cash crop was still out there. This is something that I'm personally really interested in, like the joint field operations thing and the hassle factor associated with getting the cover crop seeded and established, especially in regions that have more constraints in terms of the length of the growing season. Another thing that we were starting to hear about among the farmers that we were working with, all kinds of innovations going on, but there were things like putting a seeder box on their combine. So as they were combining, they could broadcast at the same time, right? So a lot of really cool stuff going on to try and figure out how to make it work just in terms of labor. Around here, what you'll often see is the 1 or 2 combines out in the field running, and then somebody out there just going behind and seeding the cover crop. So not really a joint operation, but joint in terms of the timing. Termination. So this is another really interesting one. Again, there's a lot of interest in when the cover crop is terminated for a couple of reasons. One would be soil health, but the other is that growth and biomass can drive a lot of different things, right? It can be really important to water quality, but it can also present a lot of challenges for the farmer in terms of terminating that amount of biomass and also potentially compete with cash crop growth, right? So in particular, in the case of cereal rye, a lot of our farmers were experimenting with how to terminate that cereal rye and how to provide nitrogen at the right rate and time for that cash crop that followed, especially if it was corn, right? So just distribution of termination timing. Most common was that farmers were terminating their cover crop within the 2 weeks prior to cash crop planting. About 27% planted green, or they terminated their cover crop at or after planting. And 24% terminated more than 2 weeks prior to planting. 10% planted a cover crop that winter killed. I'm not going to go through each of these, but during my time at SHP, we put together a report with Environmental Defense Fund where we talked about some of these differences and challenges with cover cropping and featured some farmer profiles. And I thought this was a really nice depiction of just how different cover cropping can look across different farms, in part due to farm size and the cropping systems that they're working with, also according to their soil health goals. So you can see that there's everything from single species cereal rye with an $8 per acre seed cost to a $25 per acre mix. That person, I believe, had that mix out there because they were participating in an EQIP program. And you see that people are flying on their seed, they're drilling their seed, interseeding. So this is something that I always try and emphasize when I'm talking to audiences that know nothing about cover crops. I say, you know, a cover crop is not a cover crop, is not a cover crop, right? A cover crop could be this crop, it could be another crop, it could be a bunch of different crops mixed together. And their management looks very, very different depending on what your goals are and what you're putting out there. So I liked this contrast and mix for that example. Finally, I wanted to highlight a couple things, sort of a forward-looking picture of what we have going on at ERS with respect to cover crops. So I have these 2 congressionally directed reports that I'm working on right now, one with you all at UNL on cover crops and livestock integration. And then I have another one it's basically a big picture look at the economics of soil health practices. So a lot of what you've seen in here talking about cover crops, but also looking at adoption rates for tillage practices and some other soil health practices and what we know about the economics of those. We also do work on some of the these federal programs that I've talked about, their role in incentivizing cover crop adoption. So I have some colleagues, Brian Pratt is leading some work right now, looking at some specific EQIP initiatives that NRCS has put out, where they've varied maybe the amount of funding that's available or the payment rate at the margin that's available in different regions, and then looking at the differential impact on cover crop adoption across the landscape. Ben Gramig, who recently joined us at ERS, and Brian Pratt are doing some work on impacts of cover crops on yields. Ben's been looking at the impact of cover crops and reduced tillage on input costs and yields as well. And then the last one, I'll show you a slide on this one. We have a really exciting new project that's led by Sophia Tanner, one of our junior economists. That's basically going to be a really big choice experiment about cover crops, where we're also going to gather quite a bit of information about cover crop management. And the goal of this project is to help us understand how much we would need to pay farmers to plant cover crops and to continue planting cover crops in the future. So we're looking at farmers that might have already engaged with USDA and whether they continued on into CSP, maybe if they were with EQIP, and how much we might need to continue paying them in the future, in addition to farmers that have maybe never cover cropped before or never participated in a USDA program. I think we're going to be doing this in 4 states. We have not yet chosen what states that will be in, but this work will be joint with Michigan State University. So we're working with them to design the survey instrument. And we're talking quite a lot with NRCS about what attributes to include in that choice experiment. So one of the things I'm very interested in is this intersection of restrictiveness, either in terms of contract length or practice standards. So if you're familiar with the cover crop practice standard as part of the EQIP program, often NRCS will specify what the seeding rate or method might be, or what cover crops need to go out there in order to meet the practice standard. So we're going to come up with some choice experiments in conjunction with NRCS that look at some different attributes of cover crop contracts. We're also going to look at maybe NRCS versus a state program versus an RMA payment program, and whether farmers respond differently to the source of the payment as well as part of that. And I think that's all I've got. Hopefully we still have a few minutes for conversation and discussion, but I appreciate y'all's attention. I know it's the end of the day on a Friday, so thank you.
Thanks, Maria. That's good. So people have questions, they can just butt in. If you're too shy to butt in, raise your hand or type it in the chat and we'll make sure she
I'll
gets
butt in. You didn't say anything about this in your research, and maybe you don't know anything about this, but what I'm thinking about the carbon farming issues that are rife. What do you know about the validity of the contracts that are out there? What do you know about measurement of carbon content as it's related to these contracts? Anything you know about this or that ERS is doing, I'd appreciate hearing.
Yes, so ERS is not doing a whole lot on this right now, other than trying to stay abreast of what's going on and think about how some of the private sector initiatives combined with the public sector initiatives and programs, how this all kind of fits together as a landscape, and how that might influence the farmer adoption decision. On the measurement side of things, certainly a lot of the farmers that I engaged with in my previous role were engaged in some of these private programs or initiatives, and we did have some partnerships when I was at SHP that were also looking at different ways to do this. I think in general, if I can sort of speak from my experience, most of the programs that are out there right now, we're struggling quite a bit with how much to measure, how much to rely on modeled estimates, when to do a combination of both. And there was quite a bit of variability in terms of when they were paying farmers or how much they were committing to as well. So we did have one farmer who's been pretty vocal in the news who's sort of a spokesperson for cover crops, that was participating with one of these private programs and successfully held an auction for the carbon on his farm in Maryland. But part of that was because he had done a great job of diligently tracking his practices with the help of a number of different partners over the last number of years, right? So he was poised when that opportunity came about to take all of that historical data and basically feed it into a model that generated an estimate for the amount of carbon that he had been generating over the last however many years since he had started changing his farming practices. So that's a little bit of a unique example, but I think a lot of farmers were beginning to invest in better measurement of practices and management practices as a sort of a preemptive attempt to figure out how to participate in programs. At the same time, I've observed a lot of confusion in this space and farmers that just don't know what to do with being approached by a lot of different companies. And sometimes the programs are changing, which I think makes it extra confusing. So there's a lot of interest on the supply side, on the farmer side, but also I think a lot of confusion. I don't know if you all know about some of the recent USDA things that have come out. One thing, let me see if I can just pop it in the chat. There is a commodity climate smart partnership for climate smart ag, partnerships for climate smart commodities, which is basically a new USDA. It's almost like a grant program, but it's designed to move this space forward with respect to generating, I think, robust supply chains for commodities that are produced with climate smart practices. So it's not directly carbon, but I think, to the extent that carbon is pretty involved in quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, it is also carbon. I just tossed that in the chat.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
So Maria, question came in on the interface between soil health and termination method, specifically tillage, use of herbicide, grazing, whatever. Is that included in some of that stuff that you were looking at or in the works?
So I don't personally have any work on that, and we haven't looked at that in any of the soil health partnership data. I think it's a really interesting question, though, in part because I know there's some ARS research that's been going on organic farming systems that in some cases are more tillage intensive, right? But also have a lot of organic matter being incorporated into the soil as part of those systems. So I think the more I learn on this, the more I know that there are no easy answers. The more I know I don't know. And I think across the board with tillage and cover crops, we still have a lot to learn on both soil health impacts as well as some of those carbon outcomes over the long haul.
Thanks. Other questions from folks?
Oh, Danelle.
Yeah, Danelle's got a good one for you there.
Yeah, so I actually started in geo. So in between my master's and PhD, I was at the Woodwell Climate Center, which does a lot of work on terrestrial carbon in ecosystems. So I was doing work on deforestation in Brazil for my master's and part of my PhD. So I did sort of a think tank nonprofit, and then actually coming out of my PhD, I did a little stint at the Natural Resources Defense Council as well, working on antibiotic use in livestock. So I feel like I've had 3 very different experiences at sort of industry and nonprofits, and each of them has been very educational. And I think I've gotten, let me put it this way, I've gotten less insecure about not always having the most complicated or empirically complicated research, right? Like my goal as a researcher and a human being is not to make sure I'm staying abreast of the most recent econometric techniques and properly identifying things all the time. I think I've become more comfortable with being a researcher that emphasizes fundamental questions that are needed to understand the research landscape and get other people excited about a research topic. I think that's really important. And I think it's important in the policy space as well. Sometimes I think we get so fixated on figuring out whether we've come up with a causal identification strategy that we miss the big picture and we miss communicating the things that matter to people. So I think that's part of why I'm here doing these types of overview presentations, and part of why that's some of my role now is that is valuable, and it's really, really valuable in the government and policy space, I think. I've also had a lot of really crazy stories, as you can imagine, working for NRDC, working with farmers, like lots of crazy stories.
Other questions for folks? I know I find it interesting, this stuff that you're doing on, you know, barriers to adoption, willingness to adopt, and so on. And you mentioned no-till in particular in one of your earlier slides, kind of peeking out. But I just think a no-till, you know, once the farmer adopts that equipment wise, and of course expands their acres usually tremendously, going from tillage to no-till, you pretty much don't need to incentivize them anymore. And I'm really wondering about the end game in cover crops, I guess, is what I would describe it as.
Yep. Yeah, I think we don't really understand the truly long-term dynamic of cover crop adoption, in part because the people who have been doing it for a long time are such a small subsample of the population. And if we think about who adopts first, it's often the people who have the most to gain from doing it as well. I think no-till is interesting because no-till adoption does vary a lot with geography. So we have almost complete no-till adoption here in Maryland, but a lot of it has to do with the soils too. So yeah, that the regional heterogeneity and soil types and growing conditions, I think, is a really interesting component. Certainly cover crops with sort of the issues with growing season from north to south, and then also issues with water availability and competition for moisture east to west. That can go both ways, right? Like a cover crop can help you deal with drought in certain situations, but it can also compete for moisture with that growing cash crop. And so a lot of really interesting dynamics there too, in terms of regional dynamics and soils.
Maria, kind of building off of that, you had mentioned that there's no real economic incentive for producers to adopt these relative to soil health practices, and that the government is willing to pay producers to adopt this. What does the damage curve look like from mismanagement of soil? Normally in like these, you'd estimate like a damage curve, and then you'd have that willingness to accept, and then you have some optimum premium you're willing to pay. So maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I mean, I think it depends on which element of the damage you're talking about. I mean, obviously there are a lot of different pieces of soil erosion that have environmental externalities, sedimentation, also sort of the nutrient loss that's associated with that. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there's even, you know, you can talk about a food security component or a supply chain resilience component to that as well. And I think those are the things that we really need to be studying, frankly. What is the public cost or benefit of not engaging in these practices? And therefore, what should we be paying farmers to do these things?
So my follow-up question to that is, assuming that this hasn't been estimated, so what is driving the government or incentivizing the government to provide these or really push this programs forward? Is it just assumed costs? Is it maybe?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I can't speculate too much on that, but I think in general in the policy community, it's widely accepted that it's directionally correct. Like the combined set of ecosystem services provided by cover crops has a net positive social benefit. So therefore we should pay for them. I'm not sure we've really thought through how much of that is water quality, how much of that is climate mitigation. That's the way I approach it personally, is that we think that the net gain it's worth it from a social benefit perspective, and that's why we pay for them. But we haven't really thought through under which conditions. Is it primarily water quality? When is it climate mitigation? I don't know.
That's not what drives the other payoffs to farmers, right? I mean, crop insurance being so subsidized and so forth. So.
Yeah, the federal policy space is really interesting. I've been talking, so our division director, Tom Worth, used to be at RMA, and we've been talking a lot about how we can do some more research, sort of looking at that intersection of crop insurance and conservation practices.
Yeah, I can't help but think that we pay for things twice in many ways, right? We incentivize one behavior with one program and then double down in another program to get them to do something different. We got a bunch of grad students on. Any of you grad students have any questions? You don't have to be shy just because it's on Zoom. I guess they're going to remain shy.
Hi, Maria. I actually work for Dr. Perrin and Dr. Fulginiti on what Dr. Perrin asked about the carbon sequestration and getting paid for that. So I appreciate you sharing that information.
I'd be happy to share there are some good resources. Alejandra Plastina just put together, I don't know if you saw a recent article summarizing some of those programs, and there's some other good ones sort of geared toward farmers also. So happy to share some of those if you all haven't seen them.
Do you see any regional variation in cover crop adoption for monetary reasons?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things we've actually been looking at, and this is for tillage, but I think it applies, we've been looking at an interesting difference between how EQIP money went out the door for no-till in North versus South Dakota, kind of as a natural experiment. And we see a lot of that with regional initiatives that are maybe water quality driven, where there might be a lot more funding for cover crops in a particular region, in addition to some of those state programs that are paying for cover crops. So I think that's one of the big reasons that we see differences at some of those state lines for where they're adopted and where they're not.
You mentioned that in Maryland, and I assume is it all state funding that's pushing that? Those monies, or are they coming through some federal program that the state's administering?
It's state, and I can drop the link in. I think it's funded through, I might be getting this wrong. We did a choices article on this. Lori Lynch and I did a choices article on it a few years back. But it's called the Maryland Agricultural Water Quality Cost Share Program. And I think it's partially funded by like a tax in Baltimore, like in urban areas that they then funnel into cover crops and other ag practices. So they have kind of an interesting state level mechanism for that.
That's interesting.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So my question is, what would you consider as the best proxy or the best indicator to evaluate soil health, while you don't have access to very to measurable environmental indicators, or like your access to data is kind of limited? Like, what would you consider as would yield per acre or per hectare would be enough, maybe?
I think in general, the best thing you could include in a regression, if you have an actual georeference data point, would be to just get the soil series from the Surgo database, because I think if you can account for soil texture and slope and some of those other environmental things, that's actually, it obviously doesn't really get at the management component, but it gets at the biophysical component. And then you can probably use some other proxies for different things to control for management to get that side of it. So certainly yield impacts soil health through a number of different channels. And also a lot of the things that you're managing for to get a higher yield impact soil health, but it's not direct. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I'd probably throw a bunch of stuff in there and hope that you're picking things up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Okay, one more question. It's about the livestock integration and the crop livestock integration and the adoption of cover crops. So, like, do you have any so far, like, any results or on indicators that are that might advocate for cover crop adoption under livestock crop livestock integration?
So I think the main points that we are trying to bring out in the report that you were helping us with, Maria, is a lot of people are starting to do it, which is sort of a de facto indicator that it is economically profitable on some operations. And the literature suggests that it's profitable as well. So I think in terms of how we're framing things for the report, we're sort of starting to say, look, adoption of cover crops is higher on some of these livestock operations than on crop farms alone. So there's some indication that it changes the profitability on the enterprise when you integrate the cover crops on the livestock operation relative to just cover. And it makes sense, right? If you're using it, it's obviously going to offset some of those costs. I think what starts to get interesting is, you know, this confluence of how does that change the soil health picture? How does that change the ecosystem services? Obviously, it has a benefit in terms of livestock feed. What are the trade-offs when you think about some of the other things we're trying to accomplish with cover crops? And that's, you know, that's part of the reason it's complicated at the USDA level, how they view using some of these programs for financial assistance on livestock operations or where that might be used. And this is something that I ran into a lot when we had stakeholder discussions. Was, you know, NRCS would say, well, we don't pay for that, but now we're paying for annual forages, or we're trialing an annual forages equip, which essentially is a cover crop, except they're not calling it a cover crop because in there, right? So a lot of really interesting thinking around how to design programs that are incentivizing the practice, but also accounting for the fact that there's more of a private benefit in some situations. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes.
But
Thank you.
Hi, Maria. Thanks for your presentation. I also have a question. So when we think about agriculture being more sustainable, one of the things that comes to our mind is adopting more cover crops. And we know that many countries have targets in terms of achieving sustainability goals. So my question is, does the USDA do any kind of assessment on what other countries are doing? Or is there any kind of benchmark in terms of where the US would like to be compared to countries such as Brazil, for example?
great question. I am not aware that at the USDA level, we've done an assessment of where we're at relative to other countries, but I have occasionally been involved in some of these like OECD or FAO discussions that are trying to compare levels of practice adoption across countries and track that. So I don't know that we have a benchmark, though I think there might have been one in one of the reports that got released by USDA since the change in the administration. I feel like I'll have to look it up because I don't want to put the wrong acreage number, but I feel like maybe USDA spoke some kind of an acreage target for cover crops. For the last 5 or 10 years, it's mostly been the nonprofit community that's pushing those acreage targets. So there's more and more movement to trying to figure out, you know, what's technically feasible, like where could we put cover crops and where are we likely to have cover crops show up on their own without financial incentives, and then what types of financial incentives would be needed. So my hope is that some of this work that we're doing with the choice experiments is going to help draw out that supply curve at different payment points. So if we did set a target, or we did try and figure out what type of payment was necessary, we'd have more information to be able to reach those targets.
I'm a little curious, Maria and or Jay. I'm thinking about beef cow operations and cover crops. And if we've got beef cow out on the range or got them on pastures, obviously we don't need cover crops because it's covered. I assume that's correct. So the cover crops related to beef operations must be cover, they're grazing cover, late cover crop over corn or what? How do,
Yep.
what are you observing?
Yeah, well, Jay, you can go ahead and answer that. You probably have a better answer than I do.
Yeah, so yeah, we are observing it when they have integrated systems. So like, for example, Dick in the Sandhills, you know, where you got miles and miles of just grass, you might not see people out on cover crops, but as you go out to the fringe of it, especially as you go into the panhandle, northern panhandle, a lot of people there are using, say, circles of corn or irrigated corn, and they're harvesting for silage and putting in cover crops, or sometimes they're double cropping a forage on that as part of the rotation to help supplement the pasture. And I don't know, Mary, you got any other observations from what's going on in the east? Eastern
Yeah,
Nebraska?
I guess I would just say that the thing that, especially in eastern Nebraska, you'll see is that producers are having cover crops that are actual cover crops that would either be available early in spring before pasture would be ready. And so that's one of the great uses, especially for rye or winter wheat, or they're using it and they like that because it also can delay them putting out onto, say, their brome grass, which then allows them to graze a little bit longer into the fall. The other thing that you see is the other end of it, right? So they put something in maybe after wheat, and that can allow them to graze into the fall, maybe even early winter, after the grass is done, essentially the perennial grass. So that's kind of the two systems that are very common. As Jay said, some people do not really a cover crop, but an annual forage. And then they may be pulling off in the summer slump for brome and actually going on to that, and again, allowing a little bit more growth to come on in the fall.
Yeah, Dick, we're having I don't want to call it a war, but conversations about what's a cover crop and what's an annual forage. Depends on people's objectives and why they're planning it, I guess, or at least the priorities, those objectives.
Maria, this is a question for you, or maybe Mary, you can answer this. What's the primary differences between someone who would want to plant a cover crop and graze that versus go to corn stalks?
I would say timing. I mean, the primary difference is just if I could go to stalks. So there are people who do both, and usually the biggest difference is I can get on the cover crop before I can get onto stalks. Or I have a different class of animals, right? Like, so I want to use the high quality forage for cattle who have high requirements and go to stalks for cattle who have low requirements, like those pregnant cows. That way I don't have to supplement on stocks.
So does the crop producer then have to make, who potentially engages in that, do they have to make a trade-off between whether just to keep it in the corn stalks or to plant a cover crop if they're trying to attract basically producers to use their land, or no?
No, I would say if there's a person who has stocks and they want them grazed, that's fairly easy to come across somebody to graze them. So I don't think a decision about whether or not they're going to apply a cover crop really is driven based off of, well, I want to upgrade my forage because I can't sell my stocks. Usually it's, I want to upgrade my forage because I want to get a little more weight on my cattle. I see very few people who the primary purpose would be the feed value over stocks. Because frankly, the decision, in my mind anyways, the decision about what can I plant on corn harvested for grain is there isn't anything that you can get very much biomass on in the fall. So corn harvested for grain, the decision to plant something is more based off of, well, if I want to try to get something up in the spring. And there are people who do that, but then usually honestly, the biggest challenge is whether or not the grazing of stalks is going to impact that cover crop. And if it's germinated, then it could.
Makes sense. Thanks.
And as Maria alluded to in the climate and the growing degree days and everything is a big deal. Mary just mentioned the biggest thing in Nebraska is most people are growing corn and harvesting it for grain, which is a big barrier to getting something established.
Yeah, and it gets complicated to try and get something in there before you harvest. So, yeah.
Well, there aren't any other questions. I don't know. I think we're pretty much run up against our time here, Dick. I don't know if you have closing comments and other things. We definitely want to thank you, Maria, for taking the time to visit with us today. Wish you could have been in person, but
Me
it's about
too.
as close to in person as we could. The conversation was good.
It was.
So,
Yes, I have nothing more than that to double. I was very happy to have you participating in this, Maria. I hope we'll get out here sometime and we will have a chance to meet you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dick, and good to see you, Jay and Mary, Marua, and thank you everyone for coming in for the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.